Hey, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about the book American Gods. This was a book that I actually had been interested in for a while. I heard about this property from the series on Stars, and I watched the first season and I loved it. I thought it was visually spectacular, as well as I love the storyline. Although it was kind of meandering, I was okay with it because everything was interesting. So decided to pick up this book, and yeah, it was definitely interesting. So this book is about 400 pages and is basically kind of a road trip story. The premise of the book is you have your main protagonist, who's Shadow Moon, and he just got released from prison. And after kind of having his life kind of torn apart, he gets released from prison and he's ready to start again. But he finds out that an accident's happened, and he meets up with this man named Mr. Wednesday, who intends to hire him for protection. Basically, is what he tells him. But the premise of the book is that there's a war brewing, a war between the old gods and the new gods of America, basically. What you have here is you have the old gods being cultural gods from other countries, just because America is a melting pot. And essentially, when people came over, they brought their faith and religion with them. So those gods are personified, which I thought was pretty cool. Now, what you have is you have these old gods that are desperate for worship, desperate for attention and stuff like that. So the way that these gods get their power is through worship. So if you think about a god like Odin, for example, if somebody came, so for example, in the book, they mention that Vikings actually visited, I think, North America a really long time ago. And they did they did a sacrifice for Odin. So you think about that, and that actually made Odin personify in modern day, well, what would become modern day America. But you think about how many people are worshiping Odin today, and no, I assume not many people. But on top of that, what you have is you have a god's power being derived from a god's relevance in society. So you think about modern day, and a lot of these gods like Odin, Sheba, Loki, and these other gods, these are more so definite myths in our modern society rather than actual gods that anybody worships today, for the most part. So the old gods are pretty on the ropes at this point. A lot of them are working service jobs and stuff like that. So that's just weird to think about, thinking about a god working at a hotel as a maid. But it's they are kind of in a desperate state of worship. And a lot of the old gods have found ways to pivot to get worship. In the story, we actually meet Ostra, which I thought was pretty interesting. She is basically Easter. And although for example, in America, a lot of people celebrate Easter, but they celebrate it through, more so Abrahamic religion type Easter rather than pagan Easter. But she still gets kind of a cut of that worship. But essentially, you have those old gods that are on the ropes and that are at an all-time low in power. And then you have the new gods of America, which are technology, or there's technology, media, and Mr. World. So essentially, you have technology, which obviously represents modern day technology, and then you have media that represents forms of media. So there's a bit of overlap there, but forms of media such as usually television, newspapers, and things like that. And then you have Mr. World, which represents globalization. So it was kind of what Neil Gaiman did is he took maybe I think this book was written in 2006, I think, or maybe 2011. I'll have to fact check that. But what he did was he took kind of the modern day things that people in America worship and personified those also into gods. And so that's kind of how a god is created. A god is created through people. And I find that to be a really interesting commentary on religion in general and how we do create gods in a way. And I don't know if that's controversial, but essentially, even with the idea of a god creating us, we have to spread the word or whatever. We have to worship a God to keep that God alive. Because if you think about the history of the world, how many religions and gods have been forgotten? And that relates to kind of the key line in the book is that a God does not, once a God's forgotten, they actually die. Like that's how you kill a God, is forgetting a God. So the basic plot of the story is you have Mr. Wednesday, who has recruited our main protagonist, Shadow Moon, who's fresh out of prison and fresh, like kind of out of a tragedy. So he's a bit in a I'd say like a kind of a PTSD state, and he decides to work for Mr. Wednesday as his protector. Mr. Wednesday is aware of the ongoing war with the new gods. The new gods are intent on wiping out the old gods from the memory kind of the collective society. So essentially what you have is you have Mr. Wednesday kind of going across America recruiting old gods for this war. And he's like, hey, like, we need to get together because the new gods are going to wipe us out. So he's just going through and you meet all these different gods from other cultures, which I thought was really cool. Some of them I don't know too much about, but I know the general like gist of them. So that was really awesome. About this book, a lot of people say this book is kind of meandering because it is long. It's like 450 or so pages. But a lot of people say this book is kind of meandering, and it is a road trip book. So I found it to be like loosely plotted. Honestly, like I just told you the plot, but at the same time, the book does take its time and it tours across America through real locations, which I thought was really cool. And it gives like mythical significance to like landmarks, which I thought was awesome as well. And those being like places of worship, places of power. But the book takes its time. With Neil Gaiman's writing though, it was wonderful. I loved it. I think that this book works really well if you're somebody that can just enjoy characters and conversations and good writing and not necessarily be too plot focused. Because the thing is that if you are like, okay, well, like what's happening here? Like we've been at this rest stop for like a couple chapters. What's happening? The book is less about, like honestly, in my opinion, the book is less about the oncoming conflict and more about like the journey there. And I really liked it. Overall, I found the writing to be really good. It's really succinct, even though the book itself is 400 pages. But the writing is really succinct. It's not too flowery, which is what I enjoy. Overall, I felt that it was an interesting commentary on modern society and what we worship, especially in reference to the new gods. I think that Neil Gaiman had something interesting to say throughout the book, and that's kind of key right there, is that although the book takes its time and it is meandering, he always has something interesting to say. So I thought that was wonderful. The book is intercut with these like little vignettes, like that are labeled like "Sometime in America" or "Coming to America," and what they do is they showcase like a culture coming to America and bringing their gods with them. And I thought that was super interesting. Not all of it relates to the main plot, but in the main plot kind of takes a break and you get in these like little stories, but it was interesting throughout. The writing is good. And I really loved it. Overall, I think that what I've read is a lot of people had an issue with Shadow as a protagonist. And I see that because he's a bit like, I think like as you read the book, you're wondering, you're like, you know, there's a lot of fantastical stuff going on and he's barely reacting. But for me personally, I think it made sense in the context of his life and everything. I think that made perfect sense why he was kind of like a bit non-reactive and a bit like, okay, yeah, sure, sounds good. But overall, I didn't find Shadow to be the most interesting protagonist, but I did find just the story and the world building to be wonderful. And maybe that's why it was 400 pages, is because to tell a story about American mythology and the creation of the personification of these gods, to tell that story, I think that your book has to kind of be a bit long. And it feels like one of those old Greek myths where like the Odyssey, for example. It feels like the Odyssey where they're going from point A to point B, but they're meeting all these like things, gods, sirens, cyclops, and stuff like in between where they're trying to get. where they're trying to go. Without going into too many spoilers, I really did like the end of this book a lot. I thought it was really clever and cool. Overall, I felt this book was done very well. I had originally stopped watching the show just because they had like production issues and stuff like that, and then I didn't have stars anymore. And then I just decided to reinvest and check out the show to see what it's doing. And the show has diverged from the book dramatically, and I don't think it's diverged in a good way. I think a meandering book is very different than a meandering TV show. And in my honest opinion, I don't know if this book translates that well to a TV show, to be honest. Like, and maybe if, like, again, that first season felt like it kind of didn't go well. Actually, the first season did feel like it went somewhere to me, but I know from the second season it kind of just doesn't really go really anywhere. And the third season, I don't know where it's going because they really diverged hard. But I think that, like, Neil Gaiman's writing is just so interesting that you're kind of enthralled with it as a book. And I know he works with the show also, and he has, I think, a producer and a writer. So he probably has a lot to do with that as well. But there's just something that's not translating, and I don't think everything that is a book should be made into a television series or a movie. I mean, sometimes it just doesn't work. But overall, I found this book to be really entertaining. I love the writing. This is another thing. This is my first fantasy book that I've read. I have not read a fantasy book that was an adult fantasy book. Well, I don't think ever. I read The Magicians, which I hated. So this is my second fantasy book. So this is my first fantasy book that I really liked. And I think it's the incorporation of like realism and fantastical themes that I really liked. I love the commentary in general about worship and about gods and about where they get their power and about religion. It's really interesting to me overall. I'm going to make a spoiler version of this video so I can really get into details, because I'm like trying to keep it's really hard to talk about this book actually without giving away stuff. But I'm trying to keep things tight-lipped. But overall, I love the book. I think that if you are interested in like kind of an exploration of themes more so than characters, then I think you'll like this book. The themes are like religion, worship, modern society, and things like that. I think if you need a protagonist that's more interesting, because Shadow's not too interesting in my opinion, but somehow the book's still interesting. And I think that has to do with the way it's written. And it's really weird because that's not always the case, but I don't know. I feel like Shadow is a bit of a blank slate. But overall, found the book wonderful. And I think that if you are into fantasy, I think you'll like this. I think if you're into themes of religion, worship, mythology, I think you'll really enjoy this as well. Overall, wonderful book. Again, if you read this book and you didn't like it, please comment down below and let me know why. I mean, like, I could assume why someone wouldn't like this book, because I feel like I really enjoyed it, but I feel like it's easily unlikable just from the length and from kind of the meandering quality of it. But I've always been more of a slow burn type. Well, when it comes to film, I've always liked slow burn movies that maybe focus maybe a bit more on themes rather than plot. But yeah, so the plot is still there though. But overall, I really enjoyed the book. I think I gave it, gosh, you can't do half ratings on Goodreads. I wanted to give it 3.5 stars, but I think I only gave it 3. And that sounds like, you might be thinking that's not a high rating. But I felt it was really good and I really enjoyed it, but I didn't feel like it was like the best thing I've ever read. And I didn't feel like, oh gosh, like I need to read, the sequel that apparently is in production. I don't think this book needs a sequel, to be honest. But yeah, I'm going to go into more depth in my next review. Thank you.